Today you're going to learn what I call fabric anatomy. Basically, how we make fabric and the names for the different parts of fabric so that you'll know how to put a pattern onto the fabric and cut it out accurately to get the best results from your fabric. To start off with, we have the idea of grain. Thread, when we put it on a loom, all these threads up and down, are called the grain. When we weave fabric, we put it on a loom. When we knit fabric, we are looping our threads back and forth through itself, and it still forms grain. Those loops line up directly in a line with each other. When we start, we stretch yarn from one edge of the loom to the other, back and forth like this, so that we've got these straight lines that have been stretched. They're pretty tight. These grain lines of yarn are called the lengthwise grain. That's its name. It goes the length of the loom. Another name for it would be warp. Warp is a more technical term. And the easy way to remember if warp is lengthwise, going up and down, or not, is if you draw little arrows on the end of the P and the R and the W, or even the top of the W, and we know it's going up and down. The lengthwise grain has the least amount of stretch in your fabric. Because it was pulled tight to begin with, you can't really stretch it much farther past that. On your assignment, look at the letters. C is your lengthwise. After we have stretched those yarns back and forth across the loom, we're going to take another yarn and weave it over and under those stretched out yarns to actually create our fabric. So we've got our stretched out yarns. We're going to take this yarn and we're going to weave it back and forth and then tap it in tight here. This yarn that's going back and forth across our lengthwise is the crosswise grain, or called weft. It crosses our lengthwise and goes back and forth. If you're having a hard time remembering this one, look at the E and the F and even the T and go, how many times can you draw an arrow pointed to the right? A lot. It's going back and forth and cross. The crosswise grain, when we put it in here, we're not pulling it tight, which means the fabric can be pulled and stretched side to side, and it has a little bit of stretch, a little bit of give. After we've brought the yarns over and under across, we tap it down tight in here to actually form fabric, or we'll have fabric with lots of holes in it, kind of like down here. On the right and left edges of the fabric, so we've got all this yarn laid out on the loom here, this left side and that right side. They put some of those lengthwise grains closer together to create a more tightly woven edge. This section is called the selvage. The selvage is its name. Selvages will not fray. The way they're woven won't allow the threads to fall back apart right here on the edge. It might look like it right here, but it won't fray because of how it was woven really tight right here. These edges will just stay there fluffy. Keys for being able to recognize the selvage is, see these little holes? That is part of the factory manufacturing process of looms, that they actually stab the fabric on the edges to hold it taut while it goes through things, and that gets those holes. You look really carefully from here to here, it looks different than over here. That is how it's tightly woven. It actually looks and acts different. Some of them will have this little fringe here that if you pull on the fringe, it won't fall off. That would be your selvage edge. Here is some more examples of selvage. A lot of fun printed fabrics have these bands on the edge with information. The selvage is not a very good choice to use when sewing. Like, you actually don't want to sew this portion Because how tightly woven it is, it will act different. So they print lots of information across here that help you know what's going on. Some of them they leave white with just words. Some of them they have the printed design across, but if you look close, you can see those dots and the little fringe side. These are selvages. Selvages do not fray. And since they are tightly woven lengthwise grains, that means they're parallel to the lengthwise grain. Here is a picture that shows all of it together. So the selvage, we've got these dots here. We've got this tightly woven looking section and this edge that won't fray. Some of them sew these extra rows of color in here too. The lengthwise goes up and down this way, the same direction as our selvage. And the crosswise comes across here. We have this idea that we call bias. Bias isn't actually a single yarn. I can't grab it and say, hey, this is my bias. It's an imaginary line that goes at a 45-degree angle. Our lengthwise and crosswise grains should be at 90-degree angles or exactly perpendicular to each other, while the lengthwise is parallel to our selvage, because the selvage is made from lengthwise grain. The bias is when we look at the 45-degree angle coming out from there. Basically speaking, we have little boxes of thread. So we've got a crosswise here, a lengthwise here, a crosswise here, and a lengthwise here, if we're looking really close. The bias is the connection of the two corners in that square. The bias is very stretchy. I could pull the two corners of my square apart and have these two corners collapse in on it, and it will stretch really far. Bias is the most stretchy, which means you can make very comfortable clothes that drape nice if you cut on the bias. So patterns would have the grain line drawn on them to help you cut on the bias. Just a quick review of perpendicular versus parallel. Perpendicular is two lines that cross at 90-degree angles. They cross at 90 degrees here. Perfect squares. Parallel would be two lines that never, ever cross. They're always the same distance apart. You can be not parallel and not perpendicular. We can have lines that cross at angles that are not 90 degree. So the lengthwise or warp grains that go up and down the fabric are parallel to the selvage because they don't cross ever. They're different yarns. And the crosswise grains are perpendicular to the selvage. They actually cross at 90-degree angles with our lengthwise grain. Please note, fabric can get twisted. If it's on grain, that is when those lengthwise and crosswise yarns actually run at 90-degree angles, and it looks nice if you lay it out with a ruler. If it is off grain, if we line up the edges with a ruler, this is a rotary mat behind here, then the fabric doesn't lay flat or lay nice because it's no longer at a 90-degree angle. You can stretch the fabric back into a 90-degree angle setup, which then allows your fabric to work the way it's supposed to for you. If you cut out fabric that's off grain, that's when you get those pair of pants where the seam just walks around your leg and ends up in the front when it's supposed to be on the side. It can also cause clothes to not fit well or feel uncomfortable. Here's an example of that seam that just walks across the front. It's always a good idea to put your fabric on grain before you cut it. The projects we are doing this semester do not require that. The process for telling if your fabric is on grain is the fact it starts with a torn edge. When you go to the store and you purchase fabric, the lady at the counter will lay the fabric down on a ruler and she'll cut across and you'll get this big jaggedy cut edge. Right here. Jaggedy cut edge. It's hard to see one single crosswise grain with a jaggedy cut edge like that. So what you can do is fabric is pretty cool. You can cut into your selvage here because we want to find the crosswise grain. We know where the lengthwise is. It's the selvage. You cut in just a little bit, about a ½ inch or just past the selvage. You can actually just pull on it and you can tear it. So you end up with a torn edge where you could just pull one single long crosswise grain off and use, no, hey, I've got one single crosswise grain here. And then with the selvage, you know I have one single lengthwise grain. So then you'd actually be able to see if those two lines sit at your 90-degree angle or not. Instead of using a ruler for it, if you have a buddy and you take your two selvages and line them up with that torn crosswise grain here, you line up this corner saying, hey, if it was perpendicular, it would sit perpendicularly here. Remember, just note you have to tear both ends of the fabric. So I line up this corner here saying this is what 90 degrees should look like. It's not hanging over the edge either side. And then I smooth it out to the fold and I hold the fold here. And then I hold the fold on the other side. That's where a partner is useful. And if you gently shake the fabric, these corners will actually move to where the fabric grain is. So I can lay it here and say, hey, this is what 90 degrees should be, so I'm going to hold it. But after I shake it, this top layer might have scooched over this way, so I've got space here. That means it's off grain. If that is the case, I can pull on my two short corners. Like if this one was the short side and this one came out long, and my partner pulls on their short corner, those will be diagonally opposite corners. We pull on it, like literally play tug of war a little bit. We can pull it back so that when we test this again, it will stay here. Now for some pattern symbols. Once you know how your fabric is set up and you can find the different parts of the fabric, you can take the symbols on the pattern to decide which way to twist or put the pattern piece on the fabric so that you're following grain in the most flattering way for the project you're making. Allow it to drape better if it's close, or have the stronger threads going a certain direction if it's different, like a bag. These symbols, here's a whole bunch of examples, help you line up the pattern with the fabric so that you know how to line up the pieces on the fabric accurately. This one, the straight, usually double-edged arrow, sometimes only has one arrow, right here, is called the grain line. That is its name. This arrow tells you that this pattern piece should line up with the lengthwise grain of your fabric. To tell, we know our selvage is parallel to the lengthwise grain. We want this arrow to be parallel to the selvage so that it is going directly with the lengthwise grain of the fabric. To know if it's parallel, measure this end of the arrow to the edge of your fabric, this end of the arrow to the edge of the fabric, which should be the selvage edge, not the crosswise edge. And if it's the exact same number, this arrow would never cross the edge of my fabric. If it's different, I need to tilt my pattern piece until it is the same. Here's some more grain line examples on pattern pieces. And here's how it looks on fabric. I've got my selvage edge over here. And I've got my grain line lined up so it's parallel to my selvage edge. Same goes here. I just have the selvage here and my arrows parallel to the selvage edge. And you measure both ends of the arrow to the edge of the fabric, specifically the selvage edge. If they're the same, it's parallel. Place on fold is the name of this symbol. It's a grain line, just like our other one, but we've bent the arrow so it's pointing to the edge of a pattern piece. So here's the edge of my pattern piece over here, and the arrow points exactly to that edge. What this means is literally place this edge of the pattern on the fold of fabric. That fold of fabric should be parallel to your selvage. So if there's two selvages, which there is, those two selvages will be folded so that they touch each other, and then you can place this pattern piece on the fold that is created by that. For example, we've got selvage edge here, and we folded it so it's touching this selvage edge over here, so we've got a fold over here. Our place on fold arrow is pointing toward this edge of the pattern, so this edge of the pattern is placed exactly on this edge of the fabric, not hanging over and not into the middle of the fabric. Same going here. Please note, if you've purposefully cut this so that there's, or placed the fabric and stuff so there's a fold here, and then you go and cut it, it's the same as if I just put this pattern piece in the middle here and completely defeats the purpose. You will never cut an edge that is a place on fold arrow. You want that fold of fabric there. Notches are the next pattern symbol I want you to know. They help line up the edges of different pattern pieces together. They match up exactly with the notches on a different piece of pattern. I have a couple of these right here. They're usually triangles. They do double triangles, they do single triangles, and they even do 3 triangles to help you know which pattern piece to connect them. Here's another one here and here. If you look at any pair of pants, you'll note you have a piece of fabric on the front of your leg and the back of your leg. And then the seam in the middle near your belly button that sews those two legs together, right? The notches on the pattern would tell where along the side the front piece and the back piece should line up together. When you cut notches out, because as you cut around the edge of your pattern, you're going to cut out your notches. You're going to cut them so they point out to this edge so that when you just look at the fabric, you can immediately see them. You do not ever, ever want to cut into your fabric. You need this fabric there. If you cut in, you suddenly got rid of fabric you need. Cut out to the edge and it's extra and shows you easily where your pattern pieces match together. Precision marks are extra symbols. They could be circles, they could be squares, they could be diamonds, they could be stars that tell you specific information like start of sewing, stop of sewing, where something should be attached in the middle of a piece of fabric. You can't really mark on the edges where something in the middle should go. And other detailing for sewing. These marks need to be transferred to your fabric so you remember where they are. Here are a couple placement ones. This one's for a pocket, and this one is for a zipper. When you transfer markings from a pattern to fabric, you should actually use fabric marking tools like tailor's chalk or fabric pencils. Or I think that one might be tailor's chalk too. Your goal is to mark the fabric in such a way that you can find the spot and still have it removed the easiest later. You can even use thread. Just sew a little bit of thread there so you can see it. Those are the basic pattern symbols that I want you to know. And basic information. Really quick in here, your assignment. Just to review. This edge and this edge would be your selvage, which means that letter D is your selvage. The letter that is parallel to our selvage is C. Lengthwise grain is parallel to our selvage, which means lengthwise would be C. Crosswise goes across our lengthwise, back and forth, so letter A would be our crosswise grain. And then bias is that 45-degree angle in the middle, so it'd be letter B. The cut edge of your fabric, briefly mentioned, is that zaggy edge of the fabric that you get when you go to the store and the lady cuts them out that you need. And then the torn edge is when you cut into the selvage and you tear across so that you get one single crosswise across. And then your pattern symbols, make sure you name them in here. And don't forget to submit.